Welcome to Policy Matters, a program of the Fort Wayne Area League of Women Voters. I'm Nancy McCammon Hansen, and I am the convener of the local league. And with me today, I have Dr. Andy Downs from IPFW, soon to be PFW, correct?
That is correct.
And Andy is a political science professor who was very helpful back in 2008 when we got the league going again in Fort Wayne. And whenever I get a chance to go hear what he has to say, I try to take advantage of that. Andy is the head of the Mike Downs Center for Indiana Politics, and I would like for you to explain briefly what that is and how it came about.
Well, the short answer is it's a nonpartisan organization, and its purpose in life is to help people understand the role of politics and government in their daily lives, and we believe that if they understand that, they will become active and involved participants. So that's what we try to do, and it obviously is named after Mike Downs. That would be my father. He came to Fort Wayne in the fall of 1966 for what he believed was a temporary job while he finished his dissertation, and he was still living here in 2001 when he passed away, and it was a rather sudden passing away. But when the funeral, before the funeral, people began contacting the department office and family members and saying, "I vote because of him. I ran for office because of him. I follow politics and things in the public because of him." It's basically what he did. He believed part of the role of a professor was to make sure people understood why this stuff was important and therefore would participate. The center is basically an attempt to keep that idea going. And so it was created shortly after his death. I became the first director in the fall, or I guess it was the summer of 2002. So we are now a number of years into it, and there's a lot of work to do, but we've had some nice successes too.
Yes, and Andy did a great program for us early on about the fact that you cannot pay attention to absolutely everything going on in the political world. So how do you decide what you're going to pay attention to?
Yeah, it really is a challenge. You know, we especially for people who begin to notice, they get overwhelmed very, very quickly. And I hate to put it this way, but if you just look for the thing that's most important to you, and for a lot of people, that's their pocketbook. So how does the government affect you on a daily basis? Is it through, do you work for an auto maintenance place, and how do you dispose of the oil and the tires? And that's EPA, that's IDEM. Do you work for a law firm? Do you work for a school? Well, the school board is an elected body that actually decides things like what buildings are going to receive maintenance and policy like that. So for people, what they really need to do is look for that thing that's most important to them, and from that, the rest of the information becomes a little bit easier to manage because you start to see the connections between them.
Okay, so this show came about because Andy gave a talk to the Democratic Lunch Club, and as full disclosure, I am a Democrat. I'm a member of the Lunch Club, but Andy is very good at doing programs that are nonpartisan. And this program actually was nonpartisan that you gave to the Democratic Lunch Club. I mentioned it to John O'Rourke with WELT. He was interested in it, so that's how this all came about. We are going to be as nonpartisan as we absolutely can be in this show because that's what the League is about also. So, Andy, you opened your presentation with several quotes on education. And since I have a number of friends who are teachers or retired teachers, and at one time thought I would be a teacher too, I have the question that, do you think the average American has received an adequate education on how government works?
That's a good question. It's in part answerable by asking what is the purpose of an education. If all you need to do is figure out what the three branches of government are and be able to answer that question, it's the executive, legislative, and judicial, and be able to say there's a federal government, a state government, and a local government, then you've cleared that lowest bar. In my opinion, education is a lot more than that. And as a quick example, a couple of the quotes that I gave at that talk, one is from Aristotle. It's the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. From John Dewey, education, therefore, is a process of living, not of preparation for future living. Wendell Willkie, education is the mother of leadership. So it really kind of depends on what your expectation is about education. For me, what the government does affects you on a daily basis, and therefore that quote from Dewey is really appropriate. You learn that basic stuff so that you can understand 1 year, 7 years, 12 years, 15 years later what it is government is doing.
Okay. Along with that, and I'm a little hesitant to ask this question, but I'm going to. Do you think the average office holder truly understands how government works? And you're laughing.
I am. The reality is I'm not sure anybody understands that role, the elected office role, until they're in it. And I'm not saying that to be mean. I'm not saying that to disparage anyone who's running for office. It's just being an office holder is different than whatever you think it might be. I've never held an elected office. I've worked for people who held elected office. I've known many of them. And I've jokingly said that the workshop that we need to develop is, oh no, I won. What do I do now? That's the workshop that every elected official needs to attend. And that's the one that practitioners and academics would come to and say, look, this is how this works, or we've seen it work. But even then, once they got into that role, I think they would find things that they didn't realize were there. They would begin to understand the job in a way that nobody could ever really explain it. And one of the examples that I'll give of that is that in the town, in small towns, and we have a couple of them around Fort Wayne, that have Amish communities joining them, so not within the boundaries of, say, like the town of Grable. There are people who work in the town of Grable who will actually help deliver messages to folks living in an Amish community outside of Grable. There's nothing in the code that says they should do that. They do that because that helps to maintain good relationships within the community, and it's a service to the people in the community. It's something that the people there want the elected officials to do, or at least are glad they do it. And so, do they know enough? In many instances, no, they don't know enough. They'll learn it. I hope they will learn it. I'm always hopeful that there are smart people, good people who will run for office, and the rest of it sort of takes care of itself, I think.
I had an interesting experience this morning on Facebook, my second home. There were some comments being made, and someone mentioned our 9th grade citizenship teacher, who ended up being a neighbor of my parents. But when I was in school, 9th grade was, most schools would have called it civics. Our school district called it citizenship, which I've always thought was really interesting, and I never could find out why they did that. But at this point in time, because I know our son, who's now in his early 30s, never had as much education on government as I had during the public school years. How do you think civic education is going in this country at this point? Well,
there's an issue here because you right there have used several terms, and it's important for us to keep in mind the different meanings of the terms. Some people will talk about government. Some people will talk about civic education. As you pointed out, some will say citizenship, and they get used interchangeably, and they probably should not be used interchangeably, in my opinion. Government is really about the institution, the rules, sort of the stuff that you could memorize. It's not, I hate to put it this way, but it's not the reality of how it works, but it's the way it's written on paper, so to speak. The reality comes in many respects from the politics. Politics, a good definition of politics is how we decide who gets what, when, and how. So when you take that nice, simple structure of how a bill becomes a law that we can all go read in several places, the reality that comes about because of how we decide who gets what, when, and how, the rules that are written down in that structure, they're still followed, but the emphasis gets shifted based on the politics occasionally, or rules get used in ways that maybe they weren't intended to be used to begin with. And so I think it's really important that when people are talking about these things, they spend some time deciding what is it they really want to talk about. Is it government? Is it citizenship? Is it civic engagement? And each is a very legitimate conversation to have. If it's just flat out government, that's just the institution and rules. That's pretty straightforward. 3 branches of government. The bureaucracy helps to administer things. Congress has an oversight responsibility, and all that sort of stuff that you learn for a lot of folks in that basic government class. If you're talking civic engagement, well, now you're talking about something that goes well beyond the institution and the rules, because civic engagement is your engagement with the institution and the rules. Do you write letters? Do you make phone calls? Do you tweet? Do you walk up to elected officials? Do you vote? Do you convince other people to participate? Do you go to public meetings? That's where we start to get into this idea of civic engagement. Part of the problem for educators is that the moment you move beyond government, the moment you move beyond that factual the Supreme Court does the following thing. The moment you move beyond that, someone's going to accuse you of being partisan. Someone's going to accuse you of playing politics, trying to indoctrinate their children, their student into some way of thinking. That's where the problem comes in. So I think it's important that when you're discussing issues, you do so recognizing that there is no one absolute right position, that what we need to do is try to understand where people are coming from, and from there look for the shared values, look for the shared interests, the shared issues that we can agree to work on or agree not to work on.
Interesting answer. I appreciate that. Going along with what you just said, one of the things that has really struck me in the last several years is that Americans tend to get caught up with phrases, and like all men are created equal, the end of the Pledge of Allegiance with liberty and justice for all, and I'm wondering, is that helpful to us as a nation to kind of latch on to phrases like that, which at one time meant something different than they do now, or that kind of glossed over the reality of the way America was?
That's a really good point. There are a number of things to talk about in there. So you see, you're asking these quote simple questions that I could go on for hours about. For me, there's a danger here because there are folks who describe themselves as strict constructionists or faithful to the Constitution. And the moment you talk about language evolving, they get a little nervous because what they think you're trying to do is offer a new interpretation to things. So we have to keep that in mind. But the reality is language does evolve. And when you say something like all men, today there is an understanding that really does mean you and me, but
and the color of our skin has nothing to do with it.
Exactly. But if you go back a couple hundred years, it meant me because I'm the property-owning white male sitting in the booth right now. And so that was me. I actually, several years ago, I was in a middle school, and I read part of the Indiana Constitution to some students. And I asked them what they thought of it. Does this need to be changed at all? And the students were like, nah, it sounds fine. And I walked up to one of the students, she was a female, and I said to her, are you okay with this part of the Constitution? And she said, sure. And I said, okay, well, let me read it to you again. And I said, all men, and sort of paused and then finished reading. And she said, okay, now I get your point. No, I'm not okay with that. Language matters. It really matters, but it evolves over time. And we have to remember that. For those who want to stick to an originalist interpretation or strict constructionist interpretation, that's fine. But I think even they would concede that something like all men does change in its meaning over time.
Okay, interesting. You talked a little bit about this in a previous question, but I'm wondering if what you think about how the average American thinks about the difference between politics and government, and how the news media has contributed to that.
I will do this in groups. I will ask people to do some word association with me. I will say, clear your mind. Take a deep cleansing breath. All the listeners right now, take a deep cleansing breath. I'm going to say a word, and you tell me the first word that pops into your mind when I say it, and I will say government. And I get all sorts of answers when I throw that word out there. But when I'm done, and I've collected a few of them, I will ask people, the word that was in your head, the words you've heard, do you think they are positive words, neutral words, or negative words? And the answers that I get most often are neutral to positive. Occasionally there will be a negative in there. But
that's interesting because when you said government, the first thing that popped into my head was dysfunction.
Well, some people would say that actually is a positive word.
Oh, really? Okay.
Well, if government is to do as little as it can do, then sure, dysfunction's helpful in that regard. But it is usually neutral to positive. There are a couple of negative comments in there. And then I say, okay, same principle, deep cleansing breath, get ready. Here's the next word. The word is politics, and people will give me words, and then afterwards I'll ask them the word that was in your mind, the words you've heard. Do you have a positive, neutral, or negative feeling from those words? And it's almost always negative or neutral to negative. In other words, there is a definite shift in understanding of those two words or feeling about those two words. And so I will ask them, why do you think this is? And people will sort of almost begrudgingly admit that government does manage to do things we want it to do, and we need it to do things. We can argue about how much we need it to do and how well it's doing it, and those are wonderful arguments to have. But the word politics really turns people off because they view it as a selfish act. And then I will tell them, here's a definition. Politics is how we decide who gets what, when, and how. That definition comes from Harold Laswell. When you think of that definition, do you understand those motives that you consider to be bad? Do you understand why people are doing what they're doing? And people will say yes, but they still don't like it. And then I will ask them, in your house, does this ever come into play? And with college students, it's easy. You're living with 4 or 5 of your closest friends in a one-bedroom apartment or wherever it is. I'll say, do you ever fight about who gets into the bathroom first in the morning? Do you ever fight about the last piece of food that's on the table that night? Do you ever fight about? And of course, the answer is always yes. And I'll say, you're doing politics. I'll ask people who are involved in church organizations.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you know that.
Yeah.
That's some of the most exciting politics that you can ever find. And people will say, you're right, now I begin to understand what you're talking about. Politics is everywhere. So once we accept we are politicians, their understanding of that word politics shifts a little bit. Not that it becomes a positive word in their mind, but they begin to understand what politics is and the way they play it. The difference, of course, is that we get to watch elected officials do it. They're in front of us. They're on television. They're in the media. And unfortunately, all too often what the media is able to cover is the exciting things. To use the old expression, if it bleeds, it leads.
Right.
And so the controversy is easy to cover. This person said this person said that. That's easy to cover. That's not the substance that we maybe need, but it's easy.
Okay, so as someone who was a journalism major and a reporter in a past life, I agree with what you're saying. My interest in writing was always more the in-depth, let's talk about a situation and let's look at both sides of it. I know that my journalism advisor, one of his big things was that when you write an editorial complaining about something, you better have a solution to the problem or keep your mouth shut. And that's a good piece of advice for everybody.
Really good piece of advice.
All the time. One of the things that I guess I question is that, not politics, but politics too, and the news media have, especially on cable TV, have become so divisive. And I have to wonder why people watch that stuff.
Well, the first thing I would ask you is, when do you actually find news on something like Fox or MSNBC? We know when news happens on NBC, ABC,
right.
CBS.
So it really is all opinion, isn't it?
The vast majority of what you're going to find on cable news, especially Fox and MSNBC, are opinion shows. And once you come to grips with that, once you know you're not going there to find a nice, neutral presentation of information, well, then you accept them for what they are. What you've actually signed up for, in my opinion, is double the work, because you should watch a show on Fox and then go watch a show on MSNBC.
That's true. And
between the two, you'll find what they hold in common. You'll also find the opinions that are out, to the left and the right, and from there you can figure out where people stand. The idea of journalism, actually you should be saying this, but I'm going to say it and then you can tell me if I'm wrong, but the idea of journalism as we often conceive of it today is really, maybe 100-ish years old, where the reporter went out, gathered information, and presented it in sort of a neutral fashion to us. That's not a very old thing. If you go read old newspapers about, events.
Like during the Civil War and
Oh my
the
gosh.
abolitionists, yeah.
They were fabulous. You read these descriptions of the exact same event, and in one description there were hundreds of people in there, and there was applause, and everything was great. And in the other description, there were two people, and they both had lost their way. It just there was the reality was definitely someplace between the two.
Yeah, that's true. So I've asked this question at events at IPFW in the past, and I want to ask you, and I'm kind of throwing you for a loop here because we never discussed this, but where do you get your news?
Where do I get my news? Actually, that question comes up a lot, and it should come up a lot. I think that Fort Wayne has been very lucky for quite some time in that it had two daily newspapers. And so obviously I was a reader, or am a reader of both. The News Sentinel, obviously, in a far less visible fashion than it used to be. But for local news, but still there. So I think it's important to look at both the Journal-Gazette and the News Sentinel. And then I think it's also important to watch some part of local news. And I think it's important to occasionally take a sampling from all of them. So you can develop a favorite. And I'm sure every television station right now is hoping I will say they are my favorite. But I think you should really watch a little bit of all of them. Develop a favorite, but occasionally check the others. And then from a national perspective, I will go to things like National Public Radio. I will go to the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, those sorts of things. I will look at most of those online these days. I don't necessarily tune into something. I will go to them at my leisure. And then I think it's important to also look at things from an international perspective. And I am not lucky enough to speak a language other than English. There's some question about how well I do that, but English is the language I've chosen. And so I will listen to CBC, the Canadian Broadcast Corporation. I'll listen to BBC, and then I actually listen to a couple of radio stations out of Ireland as well. So it gives me a different perspective.
Ireland?
Yes. RTE is sort of Ireland's version of the BBC.
Okay.
And then there is a radio station, a talk radio station, and you can find them at newstalk.com, believe it or not. It's that simple an address. So RTE and newstalk.com. Those are two things out of Ireland. They will, of course, grab things from the BBC as well, but you're hearing, yet another version of things. For people who speak another language, please go listen to something in another language. I do want to point out that as far as News Talk is concerned, the lineup has changed a bit over the years, but it was not uncommon to actually find both liberal and conservative points of view on News Talk on that particular show. And certainly the shows on RTE as well as on BBC, they bring in people from the left and the right, much the same way we do on, say, a Meet the Press or This Week. But it's a different version of the left and the right, so to speak. There's a perspective that is interesting. I actually gave students an assignment once. I said, here's the news topic. This is the story that you're all going to go read about, but you have to go read these three sources. And I gave them a Fox source for it. I gave them an MSNBC and a BBC source, all covering the exact same thing. I said, read them all, and they actually had to read. These were not things they could watch or listen to. And then tell me which one you liked and why you liked it. And what amazed me, I did not expect this to happen. Many of the students said they liked the BBC version best because they believed that was the one that was neutral. And
I can understand that.
Yeah. In hindsight, it made all kinds of sense because they understood the bias that you find in the opinion portions of Fox and MSNBC. And it did not dawn on them that what was happening in the BBC item might have been biased as well. So then we had to have a discussion about the bias that is in journalism, even the good journalism that we've sort of relied on for the last 100 years.
Yeah. Well, there's no way that you can keep anything totally neutral.
No.
You can't. No. Even though a good journalist will try, but not going to happen. One of the things that you brought up in the talk that you did for the lunch club was policy problems, and I'm wondering, is it possible to keep politics out of policy?
Oh, absolutely not. Absolutely not. It just can't happen. Well, think of it this way: we have an unlimited number of problems that we would like to address, and a limited number of resources, which means we are going to get down to making decisions based on who gets what, when, and how. So it comes back to the definition very easily. Having said that, though, There's a question about how we decide to address, what we decide to address, and how we decide to address it. That's really what we're talking about. And when I'm talking with students, I will often put up this graphic that's referred to as the policy process map. And the first thing that has to happen is the issue has to make it on the agenda. If enough people don't care about it, we're never going to address it as a policy. Now, technically, that's a policy decision. We've chosen to not address that. But we have to believe that it's worth addressing. Once that happens, then theoretically, we talk about the ways we might address it. If we decide to adopt one of those through whatever means that is, a city council, state legislature, or Congress, then we actually have to implement it. And then once we implement it, we should evaluate it. How did it do? Did it accomplish what we hoped it would accomplish? Did it cost us more money than we thought it would cost us? Did it create a new problem? Unfortunately, that step gets missed quite often. But the reality is, given the breadth of problems we might address and the tendency of governments to engage in incrementalism, in other words, only taking a small step in a direction as opposed to a big leap in a direction, there's actually a cycle that things go through. The person who developed this issue cycle that I'm about to describe, his name is Anthony Downs. And I, of course, like to say that because people think that I'm talking about myself, but I'm not. His name's Anthony Downs. And this idea it's not a new one, but still, Anthony Downs talks about an issue cycle, or more importantly, why issues fade. And he talks about the pre-problem stage, the moment where it exists, whatever it is, but we haven't necessarily decided it's an issue. And then something happens, and there's alarmed discovery. We all suddenly think, oh, this is, maybe not all of us, but a bunch of people think, oh my goodness, this is something that has to be addressed. And we get very excited about that. But then we start to realize the cost. And by cost, we mean a few things. What will it actually cost us dollar-wise? What will it cost us in terms of time? But there's the realization that, oh, wait a minute, if we're going to spend money on that, what are we not spending money on? Where's that money coming from? Will it be new revenue? Will it be revenue taken from another program? And that discovery causes a lot of people to say, wait a minute, maybe it wasn't that big an issue. And so the issue kind of fades off the screen as we went from this moment of elation or alarm discovery, as it's called, to never mind, because we sort of did the cost-benefit analysis and decided that's not worth doing.
Okay, so if I'm listening to, I hate to use this word, but a politician, an elected official on television or on radio, and they're giving their opinion on why something should be or should not be, how do I, as the average voter, go about evaluating the validity of what they're saying and the logic of it? I mean, I can have my own opinion, but if I'm not deeply involved with an issue, or it's, in my case, if it has to do with buku bucks, I'm not an economist, so I don't know when they start talking about money. How do I, as a voter, determine whether or not this person is saying something that really is worth considering, or whether it's like, he just wants his face on TV?
Well, if he's an elected official, there's a pretty good chance he wants the
TV.
earned media too.
Yeah.
And remember, you're talking with a politician right now because I engage in this action of deciding who gets what, when, and how the same way you do. So
True.
The difference here was you're meaning an elected, or you mentioned an elected official. How do you make the decision? Well, there are a number of things that somebody could do. A very simple way to look at it is to go back to what I mentioned earlier. Is it an issue that you actually care enough about that you want to invest the time to figure it out? The reality is, you and I, no one really has the time to look into every issue that every elected official has to consider. And that means that you and I will just have to go without some information. And so when issues of, say, tax policy come up, if that's not something that's important to you, there's nothing that says you have to know about that. You can know other things about these elected officials. It doesn't have to be tax policy. But when something like tax policy that has ramifications for virtually everybody in it, maybe you want to learn a little bit about it, at least a little bit. So then I think you have a couple of options. One, do you actually trust this elected official? In other words, have you learned enough and heard enough from this person that you believe when they are saying something, it's believable? It is perhaps truthful, and there's a level of trust there. If that's okay, then that's okay. I mean, that's sort of why we develop an understanding of other people. We often go to opinion leaders, maybe for things that are not quite as important as tax policy. But, what did you think of the book you read last? Well, I usually like the books you like. So if you tell me the last book you read was a good book, I'm going to trust that it is. And that level of trust is one way to do it, because I've developed an understanding of you as a person. So that's one option. Another option, and the option that even if you trust the person, I think you occasionally should still exercise. We are living in an era where information is available so readily, so easily, that it is almost impossible to not find information. And when that's the case, then my advice to you is to find a couple of perspectives about that thing, tax policy, for example, and read them. You don't have to become experts. Get a feeling for what it is about the issue that this conservative group likes and hates, and this liberal group likes and hates. And then from that, use that to help balance out your position. You may automatically lean in one direction or the other, but take a listen to what the other side says. There's probably something there worth hearing. It may not make you change your mind, but you should try to understand where they're coming from. So that's what I'd say. If it's an issue that's important enough that you're going to invest the time, then seek out a few sources, preferably those with diverging opinions, and then make your decision from that. But you could also do what a lot of people do, decide whether or not you trust the person, the elected person who's saying this, and hold that faith with them.
Interesting, and I just lost my train of thought.
Well, I intentionally ramble on for a while so that you can lose your train of thought.
Well, I had a really good question I was going to ask you. I know what it is. I have heard a number of times in the last 10 years that people don't know where to go for information, which absolutely boggles my mind in this age of information. And one of the first things I always say is, do you read a newspaper? Do you watch television? Do you have access to the internet? And you don't necessarily have to have that in your home. You can go to a library. Libraries are wonderful places, especially the ones here in Fort Wayne. How do you respond when somebody says, I don't know where to go for information?
I assume they don't know where to go because there's too much. And that's really what I think it is. Because, you
Good
think
point.
about it, when you go to your favorite search engine and type in tax reform, there are going to be some bazillion hits that come up.
Right.
So which ones are the good ones? Which ones are the bad ones? I suggest the following then, that first of all, web addresses that end in edu are more often than not attached to an educational institution. So if it's ipfw.edu, for example. But if you've searched tax policy and there's a report that comes up someplace and one of the hits from a website that ends in edu, academics, for the most part, whether people want to label us as liberals or conservatives, we try to do research that expresses, let you know what our bias is, if we have a bias, but still tries to be as neutral as possible. We let you know the theoretical perspective we're coming from, but we try to present information in as neutral a way as possible, recognizing what those biases are. So if you can find something that is in a .edu website, good place to go. That may be, unfortunately, something that will be a little too theoretical or too detailed, too technical. So that's a concern. A second thing to do is to look for those things that end in .gov. That's going to be a federal government website. And although clearly when you have one party in power, the other party in power doesn't matter, they try to move agencies in particular directions. But this is the official information that the government is putting out there. And there is an awful lot of it that is basically just a reporting of facts. As a quick example, the Congressional Budget Office, simply answers questions they are asked. And so there are folks who think, oh, the CBO is just full of a bunch of conservatives right now because the Republicans control Congress. People said the same things when the Democrats controlled Congress. CBO answers questions. They produce technical reports that answer a question, and the question is usually pretty easily identifiable within the report. So .gov, another good place to go because it's quite often just primary data anyway. In fact, I was looking at the Federal Election Commission website before I came here for this interview. That's as neutral a presentation of information as you're going to find. Then you start moving into .org. .org is going to be a nonprofit, and at that point, you're really going to start to run into partisanship or ideology. So when you find something, whatever .org, go ahead and read what they have, but then research the organization. On the website itself, almost every website says about us or has some sort of thing there. Read what they say their purpose is, but then also search on them. Ask what their bias is. There are a couple of organizations that actually try to help us understand bias. Pew does a little bit of this. A couple of other organizations do.
Yeah, Pew is great.
Yeah, Pew is great, and for the most part, recognized as relatively unbiased when they're doing this. And so you look up the organization within Pew, and you see, okay, maybe it's a little left, it's a little right, whatever the case may be. No big deal. Or maybe it is a big deal. You've found a website that you really like and you just realized, oh no, I really like a website that's incredibly biased. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. So .org would be the next one, but make sure you look up the organization. And then obviously, as you started out with this one, it's a great point. Check the news sources. What does the Wall Street Journal say? What does the New York Times say? The newspapers, for the most part, still have very clear lines between news and opinion. And it's stated as such. It's not nearly that clear in many other sources.
That's true.
So
very true.
Look at the newspaper. If it's in the news part of the world, that's a presentation of facts as best they can. If it's on the opinion side, they're offering you an opinion.
So when you're listening to not only people in elected office, but people who are lobbyists or who are part of a nonprofit or whatever, how can you tell when policy problems are being put into perspective versus when they're just being used to drive a party's agenda? And part of this, I had something pop up this morning on my Facebook page again about an issue that there were some elected officials in Indiana who didn't want their tax dollars to go to a particular thing. And my response to that was, well, I don't get to pick and choose where my tax dollars go. How come you guys get to or think you get to? So how do you know when the perspective is logical and clear and when they just want to drive the party's agenda?
That's an interesting question because in the end, if it's being discussed in the public domain, someone wants that to happen, even if that's not their primary goal. In other words, when we're struggling over these scarce resources, which is what we're always doing, if something is moving in a direction that might actually get through, and I'm not going to try to come up with any examples here, I just want to discuss this very simple concept. Issue X has risen to the level of getting everyone's attention, and elected officials and administrators, public officials, are beginning to come up with ways of dealing with it. It's gaining traction. It looks like it actually might move forward. But you and I, for some reason, don't like that. Well, then it's a question of how do we stop it? That's as much a part of the policymaking process as actual successful implementation of policy. And when we try to stop it, we have a bunch of strategies at our disposal. We can try to make an argument against it. We can say, this is why you should not like that. Or, since what we're really talking about is scarce resources, how do we make an argument that other things deserve those resources? In other words, we don't attack the idea itself that's making progress. We simply put something else on the table to make sure that people see something else that's viewed as of value. In this case, what might be the good strategy would be to point out programs that are currently underfunded, that accomplish things that are more universally loved. And then what you have to do is hope that that overcomes that momentum or slows down the momentum of the thing that is new and exciting and moving forward.
So when you're speaking with people with whom you do not agree, and I think that's where the idea that you should never touch or talk about religion and politics, especially over dinner, and if they're advocating for a particular stance that you just think is nutty, that's a sugar-coated word, how do you evaluate their logic and the validity of their arguments, and on some levels keep your mouth shut so that so that you hear them out, but not get into an argument?
The reality is there are times when, especially in social settings, not getting into a discussion is probably a really good option. Sort of keep the mouth shut and let that. And we've all been in this situation where there's somebody in a group or in a family, they're going to spout off for a little while. Everybody knows you just have to let that person spout off for a while. And when they're done, then we can get back to whatever it is we all want to talk about. Or you just continue to let them spout off, but nobody pays any attention to it. We've all been in that setting, and sometimes that really is the best option that's available. But as we find ourselves getting sort of driven further and further apart, some of those comments are being recognized as less acceptable, in fact, even hateful at times. And so there will be those moments where you do have to say, I'm sorry, what you just said is hateful, or it offends me, or whatever it is that's happening, and you try to address it in that civil manner. But the reality is, if you are willing to engage, then you have to do so with the assumption that the other person has a valid point that they are trying to make. If you start with that assumption, then it becomes a little easier to actually accept it when they do make a valid point. Now, don't get me wrong, all of us use bad logic at some point, and logic is something that is, it's not as subjective as people think. People set up straw man arguments. They do all sorts of things that are not logical, that simply are used as a device to try and bolster their position on issues. And so a good thing to do is to actually do a little reading on logic, to do a little reading on ethics, and find out the common strategies. So this can be done through like a philosophy department and traditional philosophy readings, but you can also look to books on political communication or communication theory in general. And once you see that, once you understand that, then when someone does make a straw man argument, for example, you can say, well, of course your argument wins in that case because the other option in that case was a ridiculous option no one would have ever chosen. And you can then recognize the rhetorical device that's being used, or the misuse of logic, so to speak. But even when that's the case, there is still something that is of value that was said by that other person. You may disagree with it, and that's perfectly fine. Disagreements happen all the time. They're healthy. They should happen. They help us think about different things or things in different ways and come up with new and exciting ideas. But you have to accept that there is something there. So that's why I'm saying start with the assumption that there is some validity to the point. And then if after you've sort of gone through the analysis, is the argument a logical one? Are they actually using data that is valid, that is appropriate to be used in this scenario? If it passes all those tests, then okay. You didn't start with a bad intent in listening to them. If you start by saying, oh, this is so-and-so, and they're always wrong, that's going to be a problem, because then you're trying to find the reason to like or support their argument. And that's harder if you're from the opposite side of the spectrum. So I say start with the understanding that there must be something valid, at least from their perspective in that. Try to understand their perspective. Why do they think that? And then what you may find is that what you need to do is have a discussion about something that's way up high. Don't bother getting caught up in the weeds because the disagreement you have with the person is about an ideological approach. How do we even look at, or how do we assume people behave? Do you think that, do you agree with sort of like a Lockean view of the world, a Hobbesian view of the world. I know these are not the ways people normally think about folks, but Thomas Hobbes said that life is nasty, short, and brutish. People are basically self-interested individuals who will do what they can to get by. Is that the way you view the world?
No. It's kind of frightening, actually.
But if that is, then that's going to drive what you think is appropriate action. If instead you think, no, we form communities voluntarily, if you're a little more like Locke, where, there are some bad people out there, but we form communities because there is an interest in being a community, that we do this voluntarily, that changes your perspective a little bit. So try to understand that where they're coming from in the big picture sense first, because the details, you may not need to discuss them because you would not get to those same details.
So when we're looking at issues and social media in this country, and after the shooting in Florida, quite frankly, some of the things that I saw some of my Facebook friends posting, I was kind of appalled. And the ones who are there was an elected official who said something to the effect that high school students shouldn't have the right to talk in public about what they think or something, which just really baffled me as a boomer. What do you think social media has done to the discussion of issues in this country?
The unfortunate effect of social media for a lot of people is a tendency to get caught up in an echo chamber. There's some research that shows that Democrats, liberals are more likely to actually unfriend somebody or shut somebody off if the positions are different.
Really?
Yes, there is.
Interesting.
There is some evidence that shows that Republicans are more likely to find people of a common mind. So in other words, coming from the same position, creating the echo chamber. In either case, you end up in an echo chamber, whether it's a left or a right one. And that's unfortunate because social media has the potential to try and help us rebuild the social capital that has sort of deteriorated. Robert Putnam wrote an article and then a book several years ago called Bowling Alone.
Right.
And
I have yet to read it, but it's on the shelf of books to read.
Very good. It's an interesting book because what he did was look for ways to measure social capital, our interconnections with people. And he found that we still do a lot of the same activities we used to. We simply do them alone. So, for example, there were people bowling in almost the same number and percentage that we used to. It's just now we aren't in leagues. And so we are bowling alone. We've lost the connection. You think about houses. At some point, we went from front porches where people would sit and talk with their neighbors going by to back porches and back decks where the
big tall fences around them.
And the only people we're seeing are the people we want back there. So that loss of connection is a problem. Social media has the potential to re-engage that. But there's an issue of the quality of that engagement and the linearity of that engagement and the way it could be used. So I'm a firm believer that governments, for example, should be using social media as a way to put information out there, factual information, but also to invite people to engage. And sometimes that engagement can be simple, please respond to this survey, please send us a tweet about this, what do you think about that? But it can also be, hey, we're all going to get together to discuss something, please come to it. It's no longer just posting a public notice of a meeting someplace, but instead use social media as a way to spread it more broadly in the hopes that people will come to it. And if they take it a step further, actually engage people in a deliberative process, not only there locally, physically present, but through social media and through some online programs that are available through organizations like the Kettering Institute.
I have one final question for you. Do you think right now in our country we're looking for common ground, or are we focusing too much on our differences?
Unfortunately, there are way too many people who are focusing on the differences, and that's a problem because the reality is that there still are some common values and common beliefs that we share. Also, even when we are separate, even when we are divided, there are ways of talking about those issues that can lead to some sort of productive outcome. I'm not saying that one side's going to win or the other side's going to lose, but even if we understand why the positions are what they are, we understand the parameters in which we might be able to work on something. So if the division is simply used to divide, to push people away and to keep people away, that's a problem. The divide's going to exist. It does exist. It's going to continue. It will always exist. We need to understand why it's there and where do we find that common ground.
Okay. Anything else you'd like to add to this conversation, Andy?
Other than thank you very much for having me in and on the show. I appreciate it.
Well, this has been really interesting. I like to listen to Andy when he gives a presentation, and that's one of the reasons that we're following up with him today. I would also encourage you, when IPFW, the Political Science Department, or the Mike Downs Center for Indiana Politics has a program, consider going and listening to what is being said, because the programs are always very, very good. The League of Women Voters in Fort Wayne has a Facebook page. We try to post articles from different news sources on that page and information about events going on in the city that have to do with civic engagement, political issues, all of that sort of thing. We also have a website, www.lwvfw.org. That's the local site. The state site is www.lwvin.org. And the national site is www.lwv.org. We've been doing this show for now about a year, I think, and we look forward to doing more shows of this type. If you are part of a group that has an issue that you would like to talk about on our show, please do contact me. You can get my email address off of our website, www.lwvfw.org. Please know that the League of Women Voters is now open to men also, and we invite gentlemen out there to join, and makes no difference what political party you are a member of. We'd like to see your smiling face at our meetings. We're doing a lot of voter registration these days. It's too late to register for the primary, but there is still time to register for the general election. If you would like to have a league member or two come to your neighborhood association, your block party, your business, your nonprofit, whatever, please do contact us, because we'd be happy to do that. Thanks to a very generous grant from the AAUW Trust, we are putting together some information that we're going to be delivering around town about voter registration and voting laws, so that information can be shared widely. We encourage you also to share widely our Facebook posts. And our thanks go to WELT, the Allen County Public Library downtown, one of my favorite places in Fort Wayne. This is a great place to get information, a great group of people to work with, and we thank you so much for allowing us to use the studio for our show. This is Nancy McCammon Hansen. I am the convener of the Fort Wayne Area League of Women Voters, and this has been Policy Matters.